Namaste. This is Yoga Therapy Podcast, and I'm your host, Shira, yoga teacher, yoga therapist, and Ayurvedic wellness educator. In these conversations with experts in the field of yoga therapy, you'll find out what it is and how it can help you and your loved ones to reclaim well-being. We'll touch on physical as well as mental health, physiology, emotions, women's health, spiritual well-being, goddesses, and self-development in the fullest sense. Listening to another story can change ours, so thank you for showing up, and let's begin this journey together. So I just want to give a trigger warning. Today's topic is about eating disorders, but we're also talking about different kinds of trauma, complex trauma, the behaviors and the thoughts when we have these eating patterns, the emotions that arise, the power dynamics, and the sense of no control. So if any of these subjects are triggering for you, you can opt out now.
Hey everyone, today we are joined by Mia Bajaj. She is a certified yoga teacher, yoga informed trauma teacher. She is on her way to be a certified yoga therapist in September. She's really looking forward to this. She's smiling right now like, yes, I'm nearly there. And she's going to be talking to us about yoga for eating disorders. So welcome, Mia, and thank you for being here. I'm really happy to be talking to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you and your wonderful, wonderful audience. I'm so excited about what we're about to get into.
Yes, me too. So let's begin with your story. How did you get to yoga? How did it become yoga therapy? And what do you think makes yoga therapy so amazing?
This might be one of my favorite questions ever to answer. So if it's not already obvious from my name, I am of East Indian heritage. So yoga has sort of been part of my family's practice for a very long time, though not in sort of the very like Western asana movement focused model. I actually didn't start practicing asana until I was about 13, but as a young child, I remember sort of my grandfather would sit and hold yoga philosophy classes. And so students would come to the house and literally sit at his feet, and he would, talk about the Bhagavad Gita. He'd talk about sort of the key philosophical concepts and how to live a good life. And, as a 5-year-old, you're running around and you don't really think very much of it. And I was like, oh, it's always sort of been there in my life in these subtle ways. All of the yamas and the niyamas, like basic practices, were just how we lived. No one sat me down and walked me through all of them necessarily, but I got to observe them in practice. And so those were sort of the earlier pieces of my life. I grew up with a lot of chronic joint pain and possibly sort of undiagnosed Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. So hypermobility, easy bruising, all of those key markers. And so as a kid, I wasn't very active because everything hurt. There were days when I couldn't sleep for sort of 2 or 3 days because my joints hurt so much. And so, being a not very active kid also often translates to being an overweight kid, which is never a fun experience as a child, which of course then led to how do I control these things, and translated into a lot of disordered eating, which still flares up on occasion. It's not one of those things that I'm free of just yet. But, and then on top of all of that, because where I grew up, there were no really good post-secondary schools. My family was like, oh, we should also move to Canada so you can go to the best universities in the world. So, child with chronic pain, disordered eating, and then you move them halfway across the world, which, translates into a little bit of anxiety or a lot of anxiety. And, my parents had been watching me go through this, and my dad was finally like, not that we're opposed to pharmacological solutions. We think there's, a lot of great things in the world, but why don't you try a yoga class, see how it feels, and, maybe it'll help you regain your sense of connection with yourself. He didn't say all of this. He was just like, go to yoga, figure it out. And I don't know if this is true or not. He says he accidentally did this, but he signed me up for a community class with seniors. And so I walked into this room as a 13-year-old and everyone else is 75, which I was like, it was so awkward to be there. The teacher thought I was lost, which, it looked obviously like I was. And she was very generous when I said, no, I've signed up for this class. I'm on your list. And so she said, well, if you're here, you might as well practice. You know, nothing is going to happen here that you can't do because you are obviously decades younger than the other participants. And so I did the class, and it was very, very lovely to feel sort of safe in my body for the first time, and to feel connected in a way that I, before that, couldn't really recall ever having been connected. And so my personal experience was very lovely, but then also being in this room of, 85, 75-year-olds and watching them move with such connection to themselves, where, if a prompt or a cue didn't feel right to them, they just did something else. And I was watching that and I was like, I want to have that sort of capacity and confidence in myself, where if someone says something to me and it doesn't feel right, I can just do something else and it will still feel good, and it will still feel safe, and it will still feel accessible. And so that's still sort of my goal in my head, is to be that 75-year-old who knows what's right for them and is still safe and comfortable in their bodies. And so that's where my practice started, my physical practice in any case. My other practice has sort of been embedded lifelong. And I continued to practice through high school, through university, in various forms. I tried pretty much every style of yoga there was to try. I went to, hot classes and puppy yoga and all of those bizarre, fun capitalist ways of making yoga more accessible to people. And I found I kept returning to sort of a very, very basic traditional practice. For a little while, my practice was a hot yoga practice, which as a hypermobile person is not optimal. I realized after I injured both of my shoulders doing too many chaturangas and sort of an Ashtanga style practice. And so it took a little bit of some hard lessons to learn that I'm not a gymnast. I don't have that training. Popping up into a handstand is probably not something I should be doing. So I learned that the hard way. And over that period of time, my teachers, who were all very, very lovely people, were like, you should take a teacher training and learn about this practice. Learn the anatomy, learn the biomechanics, learn all of those pieces so you don't hurt yourself doing something that you obviously really enjoy doing.
Yeah.
And so in 2016, a good sort of, 10, 12 years later from my first class ever, I signed up for teacher training. I trained with teachers I loved. My mom, obviously, since I am of East Indian descent, said, come to India and do your training.
Oh, wow.
And I thought about it, but I decided I wanted to learn with teachers I'd practiced with, who knew my practice, and also, language that I'm completely fluent in. I don't know that I would be able to handle sort of medical terminology and complex things, not in English. So I did my first training in Toronto with teachers that I trained with a really strong sort of anatomy, biomechanics, fascial connections focus, because that was what I was concerned about at the time, was injury prevention and sort of alignment and all of those pieces that a lot of sort of Western corporate yoga is still very, very concerned with. So I did that. And part of that program was 50 hours of teaching. And I'm generally, might not be obvious, generally quite introverted, and was at that point very soft-spoken. I remember the first class I taught, the students in the back row were like, we can't hear anything that you are saying. It's a good thing you're demoing, because of course we wouldn't know how to move.
I had the same in the beginning. I think it's hard to find what is the right voice tone. Yeah.
So that I ended up sort of working with a vocal coach and doing all these other really cool development things to figure out how to sort of take space in a room, which also, as someone with disordered eating and chronic pain, you're used to sort of being as small as possible, so that, just nothing will come get you, and there's no big movements.
Invisible. Yeah.
In many ways, it's easier. And so then having to be the person leading a class and taking space and sort of holding all of those things, especially for other people on days where I was like, I don't know that I can hold things for myself. That was a very, very big learning, and in some ways very therapeutic. But I found sort of, lead 50 people through a practice when you don't know anything about them was very challenging to me.
Yeah.
And it never sat right, not knowing who my students were, or what was happening, even from a biomechanical perspective, what was happening in their bodies. It's like, if everyone has a knee injury, is it really safe for me to do a warrior series? I don't know, because I don't know them well enough. And so that was a challenge for me, being in sort of studio corporate yoga life. And 3 years later, after I did that first training, I actually signed up for yoga therapy training, because I realized working one-on-one with people was sort of more resonant to me. And then also it engages the problem solving part of my brain, where if someone shows up and says, oh, this is what I want to work on, I can apply a bunch of tools to it, as opposed to sort of stabbing in the dark and hoping it's working and hoping I'm not injuring someone. Like, that was just so stressful for me every time I walked in.
Yeah, because you have 50 people that you're worried about, or even 10. Yeah.
And they all want different things.
I know. I used to do it just with my own individual classes, but I would have people who were 20 and someone who was 65. And then it's like, you have to water everything down so everyone can access the practice. But yeah.
And there's always one new person in the room who doesn't know what's happening. And then that one person who's been practicing their whole lives, who's slightly annoyed about the beginner level practice that you're offering. So that was hard. And so I started yoga therapy training after doing a trauma-informed training with David Emerson, because, you know, as someone who has lived with various forms of trauma, I was super curious about the model. And I found a great deal of value in it, but I was a little concerned because it was very focused, at least when I took it, on complex post-traumatic syndrome, which is great and super, super useful, but that's not the only kind of trauma that manifests. And so when I was thinking of working with traumatized populations, you know, racialized people who are dealing with trauma, or people who are dealing with climate change trauma, it's not CPTSD, it's other forms of trauma. And so while I found sort of his work really fascinating and really interesting, I realized that was not the population I necessarily wanted to work with, or that I would find space to work with. And so I opted for, instead of continuing sort of in that line of training and sort of moving to Boston or doing the trauma sensitive or the trauma center specific yoga, I opted sort of for yoga therapy training, which I was like, this is both personalized and generalized enough. So I'm not just limited to working with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but I can also provide that sort of one-on-one piece. And so that was what drove me to yoga therapy training. And once I signed up, everyone was like, oh, by the way, being in training is essentially being in therapy, which I don't know that I would have as eagerly signed up if someone had been like, oh, it's also 3 years of therapy. But it's been super, super useful to be in training with really, really thoughtful, very experienced therapists, because they've given me a bunch of tools to manage my chronic pain and to sort of work through the residual eating disorder issues. So now, I mean, out of a year, there's maybe 8 or 9 days that I'm in pain, whereas I couldn't imagine that being true as a kid.
Wow. So what is it? It's the ligaments or the connective tissue that's too loose that you're hypermobile.
Yeah. I also connect like every single joint, whether it's my toe or my shoulder or my jaw. So it's all of my muscles are working to hold everything together because the connective tissue is not connecting as well as it should. So there's a lot of muscle tension, which then leads to a lot of pain because muscles can't relax. It's this whole delightful body to be in, where like, as a kid, it just felt like nothing worked.
Yeah, of course. And did you get diagnosed early?
No, I wish I could say yes. If you go like, you're making it up. I went to doctors as a kid and they were like, oh, she's growing pains.
Oh God.
So I was like, growing pains. I was like, I'm not getting taller. You know, I'm 5'3". I'm not, if I was 6 feet tall, I could maybe accept this, but I'm literally 5'3". I'm not getting taller. These are not growing pains. Nothing is growing. I was growing wider because I wasn't moving, but I wasn't growing upward.
And so how does the yoga help? What do you do? Is it just the relaxation? Is it learning? I'll leave it up to you to explain.
It helps in a number of ways. I mean, at a very sort of pain management level, yes, it is the active relaxation. It is the deliberate sort of engaging different muscle groups, you know, tensing, softening, just so I can check in and feel how everything is feeling, as opposed to just being like, it hurts. That's all I know. I have no other data points. And so on any given day, I can be like, oh, my left wrist hurts more than my right wrist. Or, you know, this joint is popping. It wasn't popping yesterday. Or like today, the top of my right hip flexor is bothering me more than it was bothering me yesterday. And so now I know when I do my physical practice that I should, you know, not overstretch it or shouldn't do pigeon on that side. And I should maybe do something more gentle. So having that constant set of data points is really, really useful.
So it's like a check-in.
Yeah, it's a great way for me to check in. And I think for sort of many of my students also, as I'm going through my internship, who also live with chronic pain, it's hard to always be aware of what your body is feeling when most of it just hurts.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, you don't want to go in there.
Yeah, like the baseline is just to tune out so you can move on
Yeah.
with your life and be in
Yeah.
the world and, not just be curled up in a ball. But to have that deliberate time that is sort of set aside to check in sort of a safe environment where you sort of do what feels appropriate to you is a really useful tool.
Mm.
And that has been incredibly helpful. But also that cultivates for me a deliberate relationship with my body where I have a sense of power and control and I can sort of decide what happens, which otherwise is pretty hard for me to find. And I was as a kid where I was like, I have no sense of control. I don't know what's happening. I can't change anything. I'm stuck. Yeah. Whereas here I was like, no, I can now apply oil if that feels appropriate. I can do some self-massage. I might take a bath. I might change what I'm eating that day. I might be like, I need a magnesium supplement or something to help balance out whatever is happening.
Yeah. Yeah. So that helps too. I wanted to ask minerals and the way you eat. Yeah. Yeah. I can imagine. So this self-agency, basically you can self-regulate constantly, but it is a constant work, I imagine.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Every day is changing, right? The humidity level is different. Something else will change. And there's just that deeper awareness, both of sort of how I'm connecting to myself, but then also how I'm connecting to the world.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm in meetings all day and I'm sitting poorly, then I know that will bother me later. So I can either choose to make the change now or I can choose to do something about it after the fact, depending on what I can control in my environment. But that it's deepened my awareness of all of those things and how, like dominoes, if you knock one over, everything else will fall. So I can have a better sense of how I want them to fall. I can't always control it. There are all external pieces.
But you can deal better when it falls.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask, so the trauma was just the fact that you were feeling that you had no control. Is that what was causing the trauma? Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what Bessel van der Kolk's definition of trauma is, but I feel like it's where there's that sense of overwhelm where you don't have a sense of control over what is happening to you or how you're responding to it. And so for me, a lot of this has been regaining that sense of I can make some decisions in this space. I might not be able to make all of the decisions because there are external factors, but now I know what I can and cannot change and what I can sort of work to change, which has been really helpful from a psychological perspective, as opposed to feeling completely out of control and trapped in the situation and then seeking control in other ways like eating. Because that sort of, for me, was the natural thing to do, where I was like, I can't control this sensation in my body. I don't know what's causing it. It hurts, but I can't control what I eat. That's the only thing I can really control. So that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
And it's still like every time I'm in a situation where I don't feel like I have a lot of control, the eating is always the first thing where I'm like, this is something I can make really firm decisions on. And, I can change or not change, and I can decide or not decide, because I can't do that in another space where I would actually like to do it.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's been the useful parts of it, is just that regaining that relationship with self, but then also with the world.
Mm-hmm. And you were just talking about complex trauma and different kinds of traumas. Would you like to explain the different kinds of traumas and what does yours fall under?
Sure. This is a fun challenge if I can remember all of them. There are so many names now for things, right? So most people are sort of aware of physical trauma where, you're in a car accident or you fall down a flight of stairs, relational trauma, which also you see that often sort of spousal abuse and things, or those are the examples that people generally like to use. Medical trauma where, there's either been a surgery or some sort of incision that causes tissue-related trauma in certain spaces. But then there's also climate change trauma, right? As we sit and watch the world slowly being decimated by corporations, as individuals, I don't know about you, but I don't always feel like I have a lot of control.
No, I don't either, especially the last year. It's just it's so in your face. And you're like, what can we do about it? And it just seems everyone who is making money out of their business is not concerned. and the rest of us have just got to watch.
Yeah. It's like, I can become vegan, but that's really not going to change very much versus, corporations making different decisions about how they use their resources. So climate change trauma is a real thing. As I'm sitting today in Toronto, it's super smoggy because there are uncontrolled wildfires burning in the north of the province. And this is the second time this has happened to this degree. And the first time was last year because of the shift in climate.
Wow.
So yeah, wildfires in North America continue to get worse. And, you know, we sit here every year and we're like, oh, it's the summer. It's just going to happen, which is traumatic
Scary.
to watch.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, climate change trauma is a real thing. Racial trauma is a real thing that we're seeing sort of more press about as things like Black Lives Matter continue, at least in North America, to be sort of big news. And people are actually talking about the experiences they've had and how that feels in their bodies, how that affects them psychologically and relationally. Like entire communities of people, not just single individuals, are having this experience. And so, you know, how else do we support those? And then, of course, post-traumatic stress disorder, which, you know, originally was only for war veterans, and now it's, you know, for pretty much everyone. And then complex PTSD, which is sort of the next level up, which is the work that David Emerson is doing, which is a really important part of the population. There's just so many other groups that are also traumatized.
Yeah, I think everyone's traumatized. Yeah. But complex, so what is complex trauma? You mean when it's slow and gradual and everyday life?
Not necessarily.
No?
I think the clinical definition of complex PTSD is post-traumatic stress. So there is one stressful event or a series of stressful events. And then complex post-traumatic stress, from what I recall, is very debilitating. So it's sort of, you lose time, you're really disengaged from your body. And so a lot of their work in sort of the trauma center, trauma sensitive yoga is just that first basic reconnection with the body to help it become a safe space, which, you know, as someone with chronic pain and disordered eating, my body wasn't a safe space for me for a long time, but it wasn't as aggressive as sort of CPTSD is, if that makes sense. It's a level of intensity.
Yeah. So it's a really strong disassociation. Okay. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. It brings up a lot for me too, because we're talking about PTSD and complex trauma and eating disorders. So I read in one of your articles about your perfectionism and this high achiever kind of syndrome that most people have in this world, and how in the same sentence you were actually saying, or in the second sentence, that it's not sustainable. And I think that's what we're seeing in our world. All the productivity and all the push of technology and gain has just shown how unsustainable it is, and that we really have very little time to turn all this around. Yeah. And you said it, you were saying it about your body. It was, and it's just for me so amazing that our bodies are already showing us long in advance what our society and culture and species is doing. If we would just listen to these annoying things like our bodies and our emotions, which are actually trying to balance our species back out and our planet back out, if we would understand those signals.
Very much so. Yeah. One of my favorite lines from one of my actually therapists in my cohort is, if you listen to it when it whispers, you won't have to listen to it when it screams.
Shouting. Yeah, exactly.
So and I was like, yes. It's very, very true. And so much of the work that I do, both with myself, but also with my students, is to sort of start to tune into the whisper. So to dial down the screams, because inevitably when someone comes to see a yoga therapist, something is screaming, whether that's, you know, low back pain or a digestive issue or whatever else that's manifesting. But once the screaming is toned down, how do you start to tune into the whispers and sort of do that preventative work versus waiting for it to escalate to, again, the point of screaming? And then it's always a reactive sort of emergency response, whether that's in the body or now out in the world as well.
Well, that's the beauty of Ayurveda, is we look at aggravation. So there's those 6 steps, isn't there, of the disease process. And what we deal with in Western medicine is the last 2 stages, which is already either palliative or surgery and crisis intervention. Yeah. And so what
Yeah.
Ayurveda and yoga try to teach people is through body awareness, interoception and proprioception and neuroception is feeling. And for me, this is the book that I'm writing is all about emotional intelligence and not just understanding that you have an emotion, but what is that emotion going to lead to if it keeps working its chemical imbalances in the body mind. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's such a beautiful model of sort of the fact that you don't have to wait to be hospitalized to seek care. You
No.
can start at a very, very early process by
Tuning
noticing
in.
that minor discomfort
Yeah.
and addressing it then, as opposed to sort of setting aside, especially sort of in
Or
this
taking a
drive for perfection and
paracetamol.
achievement. Yes, yes. Oh my God, over-the-counter medication. So useful in some cases, but
Yeah.
as sort of a dulling tool, not optimal in my
Not a
opinion.
daily tool.
No. And I've watched my family members do this. Women in my family live with nerve pain. And so I've watched my mom and my grandmother sort of just take over-the-counter medication for migraines and other pain. Where I'm just like, I mean, yes, to get through the day, I appreciate that. I'm also like, what is your liver like after a lifetime of taking, ibuprofen every day, twice a day? And how does that affect everything else, including your relationship with people? That's like beautiful systemic approach. And, holistic is a buzzword that everyone uses, but it's truly that sense of who you are within a system, who you are as a system within a system that I love about both Ayurveda and yoga therapy, that notion, that sense of connection and that improvement of that connection.
Yeah, that life is a relationship on every level. Yeah. And I think another thing that gets in our way is we want quick results, and whereas yoga therapy is a slow process, but it'll be natural results and sustainable results. Yeah.
And holistic results, right? Like my practice, like, yes, I have better joint mobility and I have a better sense of control, but also my mental health is better. My digestive health is better.
Yeah.
It's one of those, it takes longer because it does multiple things at the same time, as opposed to, here's a nerve blocker, move on. Which, has its place. And if that's what you need, then that's what you need.
Do it once, don't do it weekly or daily. Yeah.
I would also sooner solve the root of the problem than the symptom of the problem, which is also why I love this tradition of healing, as opposed to, I could have gone to medical school and that would be a completely different way of working with the body. But I found that sort of becoming specialized kidney disease without considering sort of what's happening in the liver and what's happening elsewhere didn't make a lot of sense to me. I was like, I would sooner work with a whole person than sort of focus on this very small area of, disease process.
Yeah. Well, it's pathology. Yeah. Okay. Let's not go too far down that track. We'll get on our soapboxes. How important are eating habits, the awareness and the enjoyment of eating for eating disorders, whatever they may be?
This is such a great question. Reconnecting with food, I think, is critical, especially when it becomes, and in my case, and I think for many other people who sort of experience this, it becomes sort of the one thing that you can make firm decisions about, that you control, as opposed to finding that sense of joy in the experience. Because for me, like in my experience, when it became something I could control, it was literally that person with a scale doing like gram measurements, wishing for a jeweler's scale. And it was just very cerebral and not sensual at all. So it didn't actually matter what I was eating. What mattered were the numbers and sort of, how much movement I would do afterwards, and sort of all of these other sort of less salient things. And it took all of the fun out of it, took all the creativity out of it. There was no joy. Most of the time I wasn't even really tasting what I was eating. Even though, I was like, oh, but if I slice off this much more, then I can have this higher caloric, like I can have this chocolate cake versus this piece of fruit kind of nonsense. Because, there are more calories and I will enjoy it more, but then I wasn't tasting anything.
Yeah. You just feel guilty the whole time while you're eating. Yeah.
Like I was that person who would eat over the sink because I didn't think I wanted to, go through
or in the cupboard. I was even in the cupboard.
Yes. Where I was like, what, now I will like plate a meal and I will sit down and I will fully engage with it and I will completely enjoy it. And like that, being in that space just sucked the joy out of all of it. And for me, especially culturally, eating is a very social thing as well. So it's not uncommon to sit at a table and like people will comment on what you're eating, you'll share food, you'll do all of those things. And the whole experience was miserable to me because, I was like, well, if I put this on my plate and I don't eat it because I still have to look like I'm eating something, someone will say something. And then it was just, I was in my head so much about the whole experience, forecasting possible futures and then how I would manage them. And it was exhausting.
Were you anorexic, or were you overeating, or what was it?
I was
just managing.
A lot of it was just various forms of control. So there were periods when I was definitely anorexic. There were periods when I was binge eating. It was in response. It was very reactive. So in response to whatever else, if I felt like I was overwhelmed by something, then it was like food was something I didn't want. But if I felt like I wasn't getting enough of something, then food was the thing that I used to fill the gap. So it was sort of variant depending on what was happening in my life. This is the one thing I decide what goes in my body. Therefore, this is the one thing I can control. And whether that's nothing or everything, depending on what I was or was not getting from the world and the environment. It's very much.
There's that relationship again.
Yeah. And so, it just sucked all of the joy out of that experience. I wasn't fully present when I was sitting with people at a meal. I wasn't fully present when I was engaging with food or with food prep. And like my family owned a restaurant. So like food is a big part of what we do. Wow.
Yeah.
It's always been a big part of what we do. When we spend time together, other families go hiking or do whatever, we cook. That's literally when we relax together, we make meals.
Wow.
And so to have this not great relationship with the food that I was making and the conversations I was participating in because they were associated with making food, everything just became harder.
Yeah, of course, because it's such an essential part of your family's life.
Yeah. And it's always been like, we always come together around food. My grandmothers were known, neither of them are alive now, but we're like, oh, she makes this, she's doing this for dinner. Like the whole neighborhood would come over.
Wow.
And so, we have a long history of association with food. And so then to not sort of feel safe and comfortable around food or to use it as this sort of detrimental tool, it still has a lot of impact. And especially we see this in third culture kids or kids who move to a new culture, that immediate rejection of all of sort of your culturally appropriate foods because, they're not trendy or fancy and, you set aside your ancestral foods for, fun, packaged, shiny, high sugar, whatever else is going on, because that's what everyone else is eating.
Yeah, you want to fit in.
Yeah. And so, you don't show up as, an Indian person with, a traditional
Indian food
meal.
Yellow.
Now it's super trendy. Everyone wants it. But when I was, in school, people were like, oh, it smells funny. Or, you smell like food, which is another thing you don't want. And so all of those other pieces as well have been interesting to explore. And for me, part of my healing is that return to sort of ancestral food and cultural eating and finding those things that my body actually can break down properly, as opposed to foods that, my genes have never really encountered before this iteration.
Yeah, but if you look at everyone who's eating these foods now, nobody is actually digesting that food. And I started cooking Ayurvedically about 6 years ago, quite often. And in the last few years, I haven't been into it. I've been a bit lazy. And I notice I'm more prone to infections and things like this just because of the spices. Those spices in there, the basics of curcuma, coriander, cumin, and ginger, and that pepper just makes it a little bit more digestible, everything. And it cleanses the blood and it makes the liver and the kidneys work well. It's not for nothing that those spices are used again and again.
I grew up in an Indian household, right? So like we don't make coffee in the morning, we make chai. That's just how it works, right? You get your sort of first dose of warming spices in
the morning, to wake up the fire.
Yeah. And look, we moved here and I was like, no, I don't drink chai anymore. I'll have a coffee or
How old were you when you moved?
13. And so my parents would make chai. And so they wouldn't give me like a full serving of it because you don't want to caffeinate a 13-year-old. That's a lot. But there was always, a little bit of it, or like even in the evening before dinner, so if you come home, you have a cup of tea, you wind down. And I was like, I don't want any part of this. I'll have a soda.
But you were 13.
Like my daughter's 11. I see it already. She's already like, no. You know, and it's that age. So it must have been really hard to come to another culture as well at that age.
Yeah. And you know, everyone's eating cereal and toaster waffles. You know, I don't want this now that I think about it, I was like, wow, that was a bad decision. I should have just stuck with the foods that were available to me instead of eating toaster waffles. But yeah, it was, you know, I want this cool, trendy thing. I don't want, you know, these wonderful, wonderful things that have existed in our culture since, you know, before any of us can remember. But it impacted my digestion. It impacted my energy levels. And then that was another sort of cool way to use food as a tool for control and other sort of other things that I couldn't control in my life.
Yeah, I understand it very well. Okay. So tell me about the enjoyment. Do you now enjoy the food? And what
very
is it?
Much.
Yeah. Okay.
Very, very much. And part of it actually over COVID has been, I live in a condo in Toronto, so I have no actual outdoor space except for a little bit of a balcony. And I think we had one of the longest sort of official lockdowns in the world here.
Really?
And so going out into like parks and forests and things was just not accessible to many of us last summer. And for part of this summer as well. We've only just recently been able to sort of go out into the real world.
Wow.
And so I started balcony gardening last year. For the first time ever, and sort of watching these plants come out of the ground as like the rest of the world seemed to be falling apart. It was a wonderful sort of resilience exercise to be like, you know, they have dirt and they have sunlight and they're fine. Like they're thriving and growing. So if they can survive with this, I think I will be okay, even though I cannot leave my house right now. But also reconnecting to food that is growing. And then using those herbs in my cooking, or like using that kale in a salad. It's like, oh, I was responsible for this process. And more than just, you know, I went to the store and bought this, even though that is a completely valid way to acquire food, especially for those of us who live in boxes.
Living in a city.
You know, that reconnection to growing and like getting my hands in the dirt and like watching and then nurturing myself with that thing that I nurtured was just so lovely and so joyful. And then, you know, I can't. Then I wasn't. Now I can feed people out of this, you know, very small set of pots as well. You know, having friends over and being like, oh, I grew this tomato and now you are eating it. And that just like, it's so lovely.
It's so beautiful. Yes. Yeah. It's very rewarding and fulfilling.
Yeah. To be like, I'm going to offer you something that will chemically change your body. And it, you know, it comes from a place of love. It comes from all these, you know, it's not an industrially farmed tomato. Who knows if anyone even thought about it. That feels very, very lovely and very joyful to reconnect with growing food and being in community with food and sharing, because all of those things are things my family has done for generations. So it feels safer and healthier now.
It's natural for humans. We've been doing it for 2 million years. It's only the last 50 years maybe that has completely broken down. And then we wonder why all of Western society is depressed and anxious and ill. Dying or living lives that are half dead. You know, we're so disconnected, not just from ourselves and each other, but on so many levels. That's also traumatic for me to see that we could be connecting much easier than we allow ourselves. I just want to read something out from this book that I just ordered the other day, and it's about patriarchy, and I think it's one of the reasons. I know maybe it doesn't fit in here, but I think it does. Because I think that's why we're falling apart, because we're just on this patriotic trail that seems to have no end. And in here the woman said, what's her name, Carol Gilligan and Naomi Snyder, they've written, Why Does Patriarchy Persist? So our ability to communicate our feelings and pick up the feelings of others and thus heal fractures and in connection threatens the structures of hierarchy. Feelings of empathy and tender compassion for another's suffering or humanity make it difficult to maintain or justify inequality. And so this is really important when we're thinking about relationships. Relationships to ourselves, to our food, to our culture, to our planet. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons we're in our big mess, and we're continuing to stay on this track of a mess because it's so deeply ingrained to disassociate, to detach, to not feel, to not be overwhelmed, to not struggle, and just suppress and continue.
Yeah, and it reminds me a little bit of, in the Yoga Sutra, that notion that first misconception is separateness. We are not separate beings. We are fundamentally connected, whether it's universal energy or whatever, however you choose to perceive that.
Or just the planet.
Like we are fundamentally connected to each other. We are all the same energy, but that perception of separateness, which then causes all of these things, including patriarchy, is that, I am alone, my experience is unique, no one can understand, I need to keep all of these resources. All of that comes from that fundamental misunderstanding of being alone in the universe and being separate. And yoga is ultimately sort of that tool to regain that sense of connection, which is also why this work is so resonant and so meaningful for me, not only in like, I can help my student with shoulder pain, but also ultimately in my sort of very idealistic way, save the world.
one person at a time.
One person at a time. Yeah, just like reconnecting individuals to their sense of, if another person is suffering, I am also suffering, because we are fundamentally connected, versus if another person is suffering, but I have
their problem,
then I'm fine. Right? Like, which is what this patriarchal model encourages, right? You are for yourself and no one else will help you. And, whatever anyone else is dealing with is their problem.
But then under the pretext that we're all in this together, which I find very ridiculous. But
very
okay. Okay. Anyway, let's leave that. But it's still part of the conversation. So, how did you find the process of becoming a yoga therapist, giving you insights into how you relate to your body and to your eating habits? How has that helped, or how has that changed the way you live, see, think, feel, do?
It's been, in some ways, a very fundamental change. The way the therapists that I'm learning from run the program is that as a yoga therapist, the principle is you would never offer a student something that you haven't tried for yourself and that you haven't experienced in your own body, which I find is a really interesting way of learning, having sort of gone through the traditional like Western models of here is a textbook, memorize and answer a multiple choice test, to then have the experiential knowledge of sort of what this does to my body and, to the people around me also as I do these things in my own body. So it's been everything from, learning thoracic abdominal breathing to be able to breathe properly, to trying water fasting, which for someone with, disordered eating is a little bit triggering. Because the possibility for it either spiraling or continuing to slide is a whole set of risks. And so when we were doing that practice, I sat down with my mentor in the program and was just like, I don't know if this is safe for me. Right? I don't know if it's safe for me to restrict food for 3 days, because that could easily lead either to longer term restriction or to some other not great outcome. And I really appreciated his response, where he was like, look, it's like stoplights, right? You're sitting at a traffic light, you can see the light ahead of you, and your body will send you signals. So, if you're sitting at a light and it's green, then go, right? If it feels safe, it feels comfortable, it feels accessible, do your practice every day, see how everything is feeling. And if it feels fine, continue. If it, maybe starts to feel uncomfortable, then maybe you slow down a little bit, If you're intermittent fasting, maybe you add some coconut oil and maybe you add some bone broth, so it feels like food versus just water. And, if the light turns bright red, then stop, right? Get help if you need help. Like that. I love this about my training, is that there's a whole community, not just the lead therapist, but also all of my cohort, where we bounce ideas with each other. We have conversations about what's hard and how we work through it and what tools we might be able to use. And so he was just like, like you're at a stoplight, check in, pay attention, do that regularly, see how it feels. And if it doesn't feel great, we're all here to help you, which felt really beautiful, because I don't know that I've ever otherwise had that experience in my recovery, where it was just like, you make the decision based on how you felt after checking in with yourself, versus someone telling me either what I was feeling, which I think is fascinating, because how anyone could know that is beyond me. Or if I expressed how I was feeling, they immediately made a decision about my well-being for me without sort of consulting me about what I might want. And so this model of sort of empowerment where, I am the observer, but I'm also the decision maker. And if I need support in making that decision, then I have it and it's available to me. And if I choose not to access that, that's also well within my power. So that's been really, really lovely in sort of gaining new tools, which then I can offer to my students who are, struggling, maybe not with the same problem, but with similar issues, to empower them to check in with themselves, to build out that body of personal data in their own. We like to say your body is your laboratory. So to sort of continue to observe what works and to recognize that just because this worked for one person doesn't mean it will work for someone else, or it might not work the same way. You might, need a modification on it.
And it might work for you this time, but not next time. This is also something that's, it's adaptive rather than prescriptive.
Absolutely. And it's always something you can modify, because it's not, here's a prescription. I'm not going to explain to you how it works. I'm not going to tell you what it does or what we are trying to do with it. Here's what that's always
power,
a conversation.
Patriarchy. Again,
very
you don't
much
know.
So.
I know. Listen to
like
me,
I am the expert
know.
in your experience, which makes no sense at all. So like the notion that I am the expert in my own experience and I can make those decisions with the support of a community that, is invested in my well-being is very resonant, and also not something that I've always had in recovery, right? The notion that it's your problem, it's your journey, you figure it out, we'll give you some Band-Aids, versus we are invested in your long-term health. It's been really, really lovely to have, to be honest.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Thank you for asking.
Yeah. And so who is the training that you're doing this with?
I'm training with Yoga Therapy Toronto. So Ati and Felicia Pavlovic are the lead therapists there, and they trained with Desikachar in the Krishnamacharya lineage. So that's the lineage that when eventually I'm out in the world and practicing, which ideally is in 3 months, I will also be continuing.
Oh, great. And you said, we had a little email discussion, that you had ideas for pivoting your work after COVID. Did you want to share them?
Yeah. So originally when I started training, yoga therapy is a practice that ideally you deliver one-on-one in person with a student. But my cohort has been training over COVID. And so we've been forced to learn to use all of these virtual tools. And so for the majority of my internship, I've been seeing students virtually, which has opened up a whole bunch of things. It's meant that students with mobility issues or chronic illness or autoimmune conditions can still see me, because neither of us have to leave their homes. And so, everyone is still safe and comfortable in this space. But it's also meant I can see students in Turkey and in Australia and in India. I mean, the time zones are sometimes a bit of a thing to juggle. But there's sort of been this more universal access, and at sort of, a cost level that works for people as and when they see fit is also the other beautiful thing. But yeah, so I love working with people in person, and in a perfect world, everyone would be able to come and see me, or I'd be able to go and see them. But being able to make this healing practice available globally to people through the tools that we have has been a huge, huge learning. And I'm looking really forward to continuing to use them, even though we can now start to see people in person, to create that sense of access for underserved communities. And as an example, so, I have a student who's working 2 jobs, and the notion of, I have to leave work, I have to get on public transit, I have to come see you for an hour, and then I have to go get back on transit and then go to another job. It's exhausting. Yeah. Whereas, now we can book a 30-minute Zoom call, and I can still, do a reasonable assessment, design a practice, and do all of those things. And it's not as disruptive. So it fits better in people's lives.
Yeah.
And so it's just nice to have new tools to use in the toolbox to keep this practice as accessible as possible and as safe as possible for people.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wonderful.
I'm excited for that.
Yeah. Yeah, it does open doors, definitely.
I still like to take people's pulse in person, but we have Fitbits and things now too. So
what's that?
Use all the technology. Just those like smartwatches that will take your pulse.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
It's not exactly the same, but it's
not
better
because
than
it doesn't do the Pitta Vata Kapha.
No, Maybe one day we'll code one that does. That's the other thing, right? Like all of these really smart people want problems to solve. So
Yeah.
all I have to do is find a couple of electrical engineers and maybe we'll have one.
Maybe. Yeah. Hey, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. It's such an
Yeah.
honor to be here. Such a pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you for the
Me
really
too.
insightful questions and
Yeah.
giving me the space to share.
Oh, it's been a joy for me. Do you want to share a practice with us? Or is there something
Yeah,
else you'd
for
like to
sure.
tell people before we end?
I have a really short practice that I actually do before every meal that I sit down to.
Okay.
And some people will be like, it's not yogic. It's Thich Nhat Hanh's 5 contemplations before eating, which I think actually ties together a bunch of the conversations that we had around patriarchy and power and all of these things.
Okay.
So I will read these before I eat. One of my friends was just like, oh, so it's just saying grace before a meal. You essentially just read these contemplations. So you could absolutely use it that way as well. It is in some ways a form of prayer. So for the practice, just finding a comfortable seat. If you'd like, you can close your eyes or soften your gaze. Maybe just take a breath in and out. Five contemplations before eating. This food is a gift of the earth, the sky, numerous living beings, and much hard and loving work. May we eat with mindfulness and gratitude so as to be worthy to receive this food. May we recognize and transform unwholesome mental formations, especially our greed, and learn to eat with moderation. May we keep our compassion alive by eating in such a way that reduces suffering for living beings, stops contributing to climate change, and heals and preserves our precious planet. We accept this food so that we may nurture our brotherhood and sisterhood, build our community, and nourish our ideal of serving all living beings. And when you're ready to move forward, maybe blink your eyes open if they're closed. Maybe give your shoulders a roll, wiggle anything that needs a wiggle. And if you have a meal in front of you, enjoy it.
I was just going to say, now I'm going to go eat food and really enjoy it. Yeah. Thank you for that. That was lovely. And I used to do this. I haven't done it for years, but I used to sit with my daughter and I would say, thank you, earth, thank you, sun, thank you, rain, thank you, humans and animals. And then I thought of so many things each time. At one point, my daughter said, thank you, everything for everything. I was like, okay, we can use that mantra. So
yes.
we did do that for a while. For a few years, it was just thank you everything for everything. She's very funny like that. She's half Indian and she's just a little comedian. She just comes out with these one-liners and I'm like, oh my God, she was only 4 or something. It was very funny.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, she's not wrong. Thank you everything for everything. It's a very succinct version of the 5 contemplations.
Well, for people who don't have time, that's maybe a good option.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I remember, I think the first time I actually ate really mindfully was when I did the Vipassana mindful meditation for 10 days. And you didn't have anything else to do, so you ate mindfully. Have you done a Vipassana?
I haven't done a Vipassana, but as part of our training, we do either 2 or 3 day silent retreats.
Okay.
So we keep noble silence
similar.
And we fast. And then at the end of it, we break fast in silence. So someone reads these to us, one of my cohort, and then we sit collectively and we eat together in silence.
Oh, how beautiful.
It is a very lovely, very restorative way And like, as someone who struggles with food, it was really beautiful just to sit in community in silence and mindfully.
Yeah, and taste everything, especially after 2 days of not eating, you really taste it. Wow, amazing. That must have been very healing. Yeah.
It was a beautiful, beautiful practice. And like one of the things that I really miss over COVID is that we haven't been able to do that. And it's not quite the same doing it by myself.
No.
Or sitting with my cat.
Getting him not to eat for 2 days.
Yeah, no, that would not work at all. But yeah, sitting in community, eating mindfully, sort of holding that silence for each other. It's probably one of the healing practices I've missed most. And I look forward to hopefully returning to it.
Yeah, you will. We will. Yeah. Hey, Nia, is there anything you want to leave people with or tell them about something that you're doing right now or where they can find you? I will put it in the show notes as well.
Awesome. I'm most active on Instagram at Holistic Yoga Therapist. So please come find me there. I'm also finishing my internship. So I still have to see 10 students. So if anyone wants to sort of come hang out with me, try yoga therapy, it's a pay what you can model. So really whatever feels safe and comfortable for you and accessible. And I donate all of the proceeds to actually a food security charity here in Toronto that is essentially creating space for Black and Indigenous people to farm the land and grow foods that are culturally appropriate for them. So you'll be contributing to food security, trying yoga therapy. So if that's of interest, I would love to see more students so I can finish school.
Okay, so great. Yeah, thank you for this, Nia. We'll say goodbye to our listeners. Yeah, bye. So thank you everyone for staying to the end of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I really love doing these talks with these amazing people. And if you want to know more, just take a look in the show notes. There's plenty of links and ways to connect with either the guest or myself. If you want to work with us or find out more about us, just check out the information in the show notes. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend or week, and you'll be hearing from me next week. Bye.